Hello, my name is Fran Templeton, and I'd like to start off by telling you a little bit about myself. I first got into the autism field in 1994 when, yes, that's 31 years ago, when my firstborn son was diagnosed with autism. In 1994, in the United States, autism was primarily only recognized as what is now known as profound autism. In other words, nonverbal and with an intellectual disability attached to it. I had been trying to find out why my son was so different from any other child I had ever encountered. He was cognitively smart and his behavior different from any other child I had ever babysat. He was my first child, so I didn't have another child at the time. His behavior was very challenging. He had his own way of doing things, and these things were very different from what I considered appropriate for any child of mine. After first receiving an ADHD label and then a uniquely American school system label called emotionally disturbed, we finally found a doctor who recognized his unique set of characteristics as what was called then pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. It was a type of autism recognized in the US in the early 1990s. I then went back to college and received a degree in family studies, specializing in family training for families of children with autism. At first, I didn't know what to do, but I simply took one step at a time to learn right along with my child. Before I begin this presentation, I'd like to disclose that I have a uniquely American viewpoint. So the things I will share are shared through an American lens. Secondly, I am not a university professional who has dedicated their life to autism research. I am a mother with many years of experience in working with autistic children, teenagers, and adults and their families. I am not well-traveled and unfamiliar with how other countries view autism. I do believe, however, many of the things I will say today can apply to any culture and to any country. I believe that there are some universal feelings that can be shared around autism no matter where you live. Today, I'd like to explore the relationship between comparison and self-acceptance of being autistic. I'd like you to think back over your childhood and your development. I bet from your earliest memories, you have been compared to others. Here in the United States, this starts with comparing the common developmental milestones of the medical model of development. From the earliest moments of a child's development, comparison to a standard set of developmental milestones begins. It is through this medical developmental milestones model that most autistic children are eventually diagnosed with some label. Even when the medical model is not being used, parents for centuries have compared their children to other children in and out of their immediate family unit. So it makes perfect sense that children grow up comparing themselves to their peers. Often parents make this comparison worse by pushing a child to perform to a standard of behavior. In my case, this was certainly what I did with my child. I wanted him to conform to my view of behavior. I wanted him to conform to my view of academic success. I wanted him to conform to my view of religious participation. I had actually learned my view from my parents, who strongly compared me to others. I was just busy passing on this tradition. So back to the American model of comparison. Why is the medical model of comparison harmful to autistics? Mainly because it compares autistics and all neurodivergent development to a standard typical model of development. This model is also harmful to children who are developing at a different pace or in non-standard ways, because it assumes that the standard model of development is the right method of development. Even if an autistic child grows up where there is no American medical model of development, all families have cultural expectations of behavior and development. Comparison is the basis of all cultural expectations for behavior and development. A child is automatically compared to others within the culture, community, and the family in which they live. This comparison continues when informal and then later formal education begins. In America, we are big on standardized testing. This type of testing compounds the idea that if you are not meeting standards as compared to your peers, then you are somehow flawed. You are somehow not smart. You might be labeled lazy and uncaring. When this comparison continues throughout a child's development, they can begin to view themselves as somehow substandard or defective. This is where shame and ultimately trauma enter. Shame is a painful feeling of believing you are flawed and unworthy, often leading to self-criticism and a sense of inadequacy and unworthiness. Shame is experienced when no matter how hard you try, you just can't meet the standards to which you're being compared. This prolonged comparison and never meeting standardized expectations then results in trauma. Trauma is defined as a deeply distressing or overwhelming experience that can have a significant and lasting impact on a person's physical, emotional, and psychological well-being. Further trauma happens by being subjected to rejection and bullying by peers, teachers, religious figures, and sometimes, unfortunately, even parents as well. Measuring ourselves by comparing to other standards often results in shame, which leads to trauma, which leads to emotional and mental exhaustion, which results in depression and sometimes even other forms of mental illnesses. When families compare their child to others, two things can happen. They can go on a quest for services to change that child, or they can emotionally abandon or even physically abandon the child. Many families, rather than going on a quest to better accept and understand their child, compare their children to others and try to change the child to be like others. In America, for centuries, we have a shameful history of abandoning autistic children to institutions. Many of these institutions were still in operation as late as the 1990s. Because of this comparison to others, they were deemed unfit to live at home in the community with their parents and peers. So as we grow up in age, we do so under the assumption that there is something wrong with us. This underlying assumption makes it hard for us to be seen on our own terms. When autistics view comparison in this manner, it actually is an insult to the way we were created. Autism is a neurodevelopmental difference. Autistics were born with autism. It is part of how we were created. It is not a disease. It is not a behavior disorder. And it certainly is not a mental illness developed later in life. It is not a failing that entered by anything done by the autistic or their parents. When an autistic consistently wishes they were like others, it negates some of the ways they are uniquely wired. With some autistics, the comparison is so deeply rooted within themselves that they actually set up unrealistic internal goals for themselves and cannot possibly be achieved because these goals were based on comparison to people who are not autistic. When an autistic hates that they have autism and desperately want to be non-autistic, often they set internal goals that are simply not achievable. When this happens, there is constant failure, resulting in increased anxiety, hopelessness, and eventually major depression. And they actually literally end up proving to themselves that they are flawed. These comparisons also lead many autistics to mask their true identity to the point of not really getting to know who they are as an autistic person. Masking is a term used in the autistic community to describe the conscious and unconscious effort to suppress or hide autistic traits and behaviors to fit with societal expectations. A person who feels the need to mask to meet others' expectation literally has an internal struggle going on continuously about what it is to be an autistic person. If others in your life have given the impression that autism is a disability or a failing, then it is easy for the autistic to learn to mask. Understanding the harmful effect of masking is just beginning to be researched, and there is not a lot of published research on it yet. In America, this seems to be more prevalent in women because women are socialized differently than men. Women initially appear to be more accomplished in their masking their autism because they have been socialized to be social and compliant from their earliest memories. Having worked in the autism field for over 30 years with autistics of all ages, I can give many anecdotal examples of autistics who have masked their true identity and worked to mask their unique autistic traits. It is not uncommon for autistics in their late 30s or early 40s to become emotionally and mentally ill to the point that they can no longer be able to function and even work the job that they have been in for years. I routinely see many autistics that after they have had a complete mental and emotional breakdown and who now seek diagnosis and begin a path to true self-identity. Hopefully at this point, I have convinced you that comparisons of autistics to typically developing persons can be very detrimental. So how can you stop comparisons and learn to accept yourself as you are, an autistic person? At this point in the presentation, I will begin to primarily speak to autistics. If you are the parent of an autistic or a therapist who works with autistics, you may learn from this, but this last section is directed at autistic persons. Self-acceptance begins with realizing you are not a bad person. Dr. Tasha Oswald, an American psychologist, has coined this phrase: you are not bad, but a bad thing happened to you. Let me illustrate what she means by this phrase. Maybe your parents wanted you to do things that were very hard and even impossible for you to do. You tried and you tried. You failed and you failed. Through this process, you learned that you were a bad person because you could not please your parents no matter how hard you tried. So let's reframe this. What if you looked at it like you were not bad, but it was bad that you were constantly being asked to do things that were too hard for you and even impossible for you to do? Maybe the problem is not you, but the problem is that you are not accepted for who you are and the things you can do well. In summary, a step toward accepting yourself is to realize that you are not bad, but a lot of bad things have happened to you along the way. When you begin to accept that the way you think and the way you process information and the way you interact is not bad, you have made a step toward self-acceptance. You have been born into a world that is not set up for people who learn and communicate differently. You have not been born into a world that accepts and accommodates your different styles of processing, thinking, communicating, and learning. That is the bad thing that happened to you. The process of self-acceptance is never a one and done process. It is not something you just decide one day and, gee, now you have self-acceptance. Anna Amand from Penn State University describes it this way. These shifts of self-acceptance vary from day to day and even minute to minute, and I believe all the emotions I feel about myself are valid as opposed to being negative, even if they are not immediately helpful. She further describes it as, I've had years where I hated my personality and wished I was genuinely like my peers without being forced to put on a mask. There were times even when I wished there was a magical way to function without the arduous, lifelong work required to combat my inherent challenges, even if it would mean potentially sacrificing my autistic identity and neurotype. On the opposite end, though, I also experienced the joy of being around people who think like me and who wholeheartedly accept me and all my quirks. Can you see the dichotomy of wishing you weren't autistic so life would be easier, in contrast to full self-acceptance and the resulting joy? These mixed feelings will happen again and again throughout your life with various situations present themselves. There are 4 widely accepted phases of self-acceptance. I'd like to work through these phases by telling you John's story. John and his family came to see me for the first time when he was in his 2nd year of high school. His girlfriend that he greatly loved had broken up with him because he could not stay self-regulated and was a very poor communicator. He was extremely depressed and at times filled with suicidal thoughts. At the end of this intake appointment, it was obvious to me that John was an undiagnosed autistic. He had many sensory sensitivities. He was rigidly extreme. He was extremely rigid. He did not engage in reciprocal communication. He did not look at me when he talked, and he engaged in several repetitive behaviors while he talked. Since I saw that he was likely undiagnosed, I helped him in the process to discover himself and understand how he learns. So the first part is self-discovery usually starts with a targeted assessment for autism. In many countries, this takes years to get an autism evaluation. So a formal assessment is not the only way to figure out if you are autistic. There are many self-evaluations for autism online that you may take until you can finally get a formal assessment. Even after being diagnosed, comprehending and realizing you are autistic is more than just being told you're autistic by a psychologist. It's a slow process where you learn to identify specific behaviors that are consistent with autism. You can do this by reading books and online information, but perhaps the best way to do this is to find other autistics and interact with them. When looking online or in books, you can only get general information, and it becomes important to learn how to understand how this general information applies to you. To begin the process of understanding self-acceptance, John was given a specific autism battery of testing as a part of a larger neuropsychological assessment. He was found to be autistic, level 1, without language impairment. Then began the lengthy process of realizing that many of his behaviors and emotions that he had been exhibiting and feeling were the result of autism. Each time he realized that the way he looked at things was a part of autism, it gave him satisfaction and so much relief that there was an explanation for the things that had happened to him. He poured himself into understanding autism. Most importantly, he met others with autism and shared his experience with them. They, in turn, shared their experiences with him. With the help of an holistic coach and the input of other autistics, John began to understand how general information about autism applied to him specifically. He also learned how he was unique and that not all general information applied to him. The second phase in moving towards self-acceptance is dealing with any denial you might feel about being autistic. Even after some people are diagnosed, they do not want to admit that they're autistic. This is usually because of misconceptions about autism, what it is and what it is not. Moving past denial is another solid step towards self-acceptance. Another part of this phase usually is dealing with any shame you might feel over being different from others. This shame, which we mentioned above, is there because it has been planted there as you are compared to others when you were growing up. The final part of this phase involves forgiving others who have wronged you when you were undiagnosed or misdiagnosed and treated unfairly because people did not understand what was happening with your development. And once you can forgive others for their ignorance and mistreatment, it becomes important that you forgive yourself for all of the behaviors and differences that got you in trouble in the past and from forming the types of connections and friendships you wanted to form. You acted on all the information you had at the time. Your parents acted on all the information they had at the time. Forgive, wipe the slate clean, begin to build a new autistic life. For John, this was a very long, drawn-out process. He felt considerable anger over how he had been treated by his teachers and peers in school. This anger had to be worked through. As he learned to communicate more effectively, he felt continued sadness that his relationship had not made it and desperately wished that he had had this information in the past while he was dating. During this phase, he also felt very confused because he had always believed that he would join the military, and now he understood that this probably was not going to happen for him. He had to totally rethink who he is and what he would like to do with his life. The third phase involved finding community and gaining connection with other autistics and allistics. New relationships have to be formed, and now new information from these relationships can grow and be maintained. At this point in the self-acceptance process, it is very important to share your new understanding with others who understand you for you, and to listen and let them share their experience with you. John changed schools and began to attend a school that had other autistics in it, as well as non-autistics. He began to recognize autism in other people. He worked to build relationships with peers with his newly learned social connection skills. Ultimately, at the beginning of his senior year, he met another student that became his girlfriend. He has since graduated and is now working in the community and is still with this girlfriend. Another huge part of self-acceptance is learning self-care and well-being, because as a person, no longer do you simply try to please others and not cause trouble. You learn to prioritize self-care. Autistics often need more downtime, in other words, time without demand. They need sensory-friendly environments. They need recovery time after schedule changes and social events. In addition, it becomes important to find autistic-friendly activities and routines. Many autistics greatly benefit from weekly support and/or counseling. 3 months before graduation from high school, John realized that he was having great difficulty working at a part-time job and working to finish up all of his academic work. In the past, when he was still comparing himself to others who were not autistic, he would have pushed himself to the point of a breakdown. Now he found the courage to make the difficult decision to stop working and focus solely on his academics. He successfully graduated. After graduation, he found a new job and began the process of deciding on a career path. He continues to see me weekly for guidance and support. He has decided that he will become an emergency medical technician. He enjoys spending time with his friends. He decided that he wanted to be an emergency medical technician because it was similar in structure to being in the military, and it involved helping others, which was his primary reason that he wanted to be in the military to begin with. He spends time now with his girlfriends and with his Dungeons and Dragons club. He has made the decision to attend church online only as it is much easier on his sensory system. As his coach, it has been fun and rewarding to watch his path to self-acceptance. I no longer see him comparing himself to others. He only compares himself to himself and what he feels he can accomplish with support. In closing, I would like to say, you are created just the way you were created. You are not a mistake. You are not flawed. Compare yourself to no one else. Learn to be your authentic self. It will be a lifelong endeavor. Thank you so much for letting me talk to you today. If there are questions, I will begin answering them now. All right, the first question is, after being exposed to bullying and hostile behaviors of others, how can one really start their journey toward forgiveness? What a great question. All right, first of all, forgiveness starts by finding someone who you totally trust and you have a bond and a connection with, and that you can literally tell them your story. The first step to forgiveness is telling them your story so that you can get it out and share it with someone. Then the next step is literally talking about the hurt and sharing the hurt and dealing with how you have been mistreated and how it made you feel. And once you have told your story and talked a lot about the hurt, then it is really important at some point in this journey that you make a mental decision to forgive. A mental decision is not meaning that you will allow that person to be back in your life. It doesn't mean that you will overlook the bad things they did. It just means that you decide to prioritize your life over their life, and you decide to forgive so that you can move forward. And the very last step of forgiveness is to try to either build back the relationship if you want to, or to release it into the universe. Sometimes we have been hurt so badly by people that there is no building back a relationship. But once you can make the mental move to forgive and to go through the process of talking it through and acknowledging the hurt and making that mental process to forgive, then you decide to release the whole experience out into the universe so that you can leave it behind. I hope that that kind of gives you some assistance in knowing where to begin. Are there any more questions at this time? Thank you so much for inviting me today. I hope that I said something that makes you feel heard and honored and loved. And I hope that I will be able to start you on a path to full acceptance. Thank you again for inviting me.